We're having a session today on regulatory pathways in Asia Pacific. Those who are not familiar, I'm Sakina, the Program Director for Asia Pacific for MedTech Innovator. We have with me here today our panelists, and Frederick will start to introduce them for today.
Will do. Thank you very much, Sakina. Good morning and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this 8th webinar in our webinar series. My name is Frederick Nyberg. I'm the Managing Director for MedTech Innovator Asia Pacific, based here in Singapore. MedTech Innovator is now running its second cohort in Asia Pacific, and this webinar series is part of our accelerator program for 20 startup companies that have been selected to go through to the next stage. So welcome all. We have a critically important topic to discuss today, and I know there'll be lots of questions at the end. So we will be running 1 hour live streamed on YouTube. So welcome to all of our YouTube viewers, and that will then be followed by Q&A for our cohort members. So the regulatory complexities in Asia Pacific, and I guess the heterogeneity of the markets in Asia Pac continue to be a major hurdle in terms of market access, not just for startup companies, but for multinationals as well. And I have to say I'm thrilled and truly honored to have a panel of industry veterans here today. I did a count, and we have no less than 75 years of combined regulatory experience amongst our panelists from Asia Pacific and indeed globally. So welcome Crystal from Johnson & Johnson. Crystal is based in Shanghai, and she will introduce herself in just a moment. Welcome Jack, who is based here in Singapore with me. And welcome Arthur with that lovely Sydney background, based out of Sydney. Arthur is also a former TGA regulator in Australia. So we have tremendous experience with this team, and I'm absolutely thrilled to get started here. So let's first begin. If you can just briefly introduce yourselves, tell us a bit about your background in regulatory affairs, and specifically what you've been doing in MedTech. And we'll start with the ladies. Crystal.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Crystal Ni, Regulatory Affairs Director, Supply Chain Liaison for J&J Asia Pacific. I'm based in Shanghai, China, and been with medical industry more than 15 years. Very nice to have this opportunity to discuss with you and learn each other. Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal. We'll go to Jack.
Hello, morning, everyone. My name is Jack. I currently the regulatory head for international in WebAsk. Is a regulatory consultancy company using AI technology. And then I'm also a founder of the Asia Regulatory Professionals Association. So I work in, I think, MedTech industry for nearly 20 plus years, a bit around 23. So I hope I have these different company and product experience can contribute to the team. Nice meeting you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. And I believe you are also associate professor at NTU here in Singapore. You do some academic teaching work in regulatory sciences, I believe.
Yes, I also very passionate in terms of education. So I'm also teaching in NTU in Singapore. Actually, in our association, we are teaching in 9 universities now in Asia. So if any audience interest, please be my guest speaker as well. Thank you.
Excellent. And Arthur, please.
Thank you, Frederick. Good morning, all. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I'm Arthur Brandwood. I started my career, I've worked in medical devices for my entire career, which is rather too many years than I wish to share with you. I started actually in a startup company, out of university. I spent some time in a startup and then came to Australia, worked in applied research out of the University of New South Wales for a while. and then went off to join the regulatory authority initially to run their laboratories. So I went there as a scientist to run the biomaterials labs. That's my expertise in biomaterials and biocompatibility. And while there, ended up being a regulator, so spent some time as director of pre-market assessment. So the person who got to sign the approvals for high-risk devices in Australia. And then the startup stuff had a bit of success. Some materials which we had developed in prior to TGA were licensed, and that paid me a royalty sum which was enough to leave the public service and go and found a consulting company. I've been doing that ever since. So that's my story. Like Jack, I'm also a part-time academic. I'm a visiting professor at the University of Sydney. And have had I'm involved with the industry advisory board for that university as well, and for the University of Melbourne, and previously had a visiting academic position at NUS in Singapore, as well as Macadol in Bangkok. So yeah, I enjoy getting in front of students as well. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Right. Thank you so much, Arthur. Thank you to all of you. Quick reminder for our cohort participants that are on Zoom. If you have any questions, just type that into using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If you got any chat comments or messages during the course of the discussion, feel free to just enter them in the chat box. Let's perhaps begin at a high level here, and given the complexities of Asia Pacific as a region, what do you see as some of the biggest trends in the regulatory environment across Asia Pacific at the moment, and what have been what's been the impact on outcome decisions and on approval times? And maybe Arthur, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, I think the big trend I see is the struggle to harmonize, given that Europe is changing so much. Because the pattern over the last nearly 20 years is for very many markets to try to follow the GHTF lead and the European model of regulation. And then, darn it, the Europeans decided to change what they were doing, and now we're all scrambling to catch up. That's causing two effects. One is that regulators are trying to adjust what they're doing here to keep in line with what Europe are doing. So, for example, here in Australia, the Therapeutic Goods Administration is introducing a whole lot of new regulatory adjustments to change classification schemes and things to realign with Europe. And at the same time, Europe is making such a mess of this transition. It's really not going very well for them, that a lot of companies internationally are giving up on Europe and applying directly to regulators in other parts of the world without a CE marketplace. So in my backyard, again, TGA is really struggling because their workload's gone through the roof, because a lot of people are coming directly for full assessments, and also there are far fewer CE certificates around to rely on. Whereas previously Australia, 90-something% of approvals in Australia were predicated on a prior CE assessment. So the big regulators are changing, and the ones that follow the lead are struggling to keep up. It's been quite disruptive.
Jack, do you want to your perspective on some of the biggest trends you're seeing here in the region?
Yeah, I think one of the key challenge, I think, to most of the regulatory professional and industry is the very dynamic regulatory environment, like Arthur mentioned. Established system, they will change. And we are talking about Asia. Asia, a lot of time, is a developing country. You will expect even the regulation also developing. So, it's a super dynamic environment we are dealing with. So that's why, I found that the networking, the knowledge sharing, the training is super important. You cannot just rely on yourself, Google the regulation news and then rely on that and do your R&D and do your marketing launch like that. We need a good network. I think that's why, the value of the MedTech innovator, and also all sorts of association, consultants are here, are helping different companies to really know what's going on. And another difficult part after working for so many years is you may know some news, But you know, the interpretation is another interesting artistic part. I think ARPA work as a regulator, Crystal work in a multinational company. No, when you look at the same regulation, everybody look at it with a different interpretation angle about that. So you know, again, the networking important. You need to talk to more people to understand this new requirement. What does it mean to you? What's the impact to us? Because it could be a simple changing a few words only, but you could have a very big impact to your business, etc.
Yeah.
So I think that regulation dynamic and interpretation will be the key challenge, and something I highly recommend we should have a good network.
That's a great point, Jack. And Crystal, from your perspective, what do you see are the biggest trends in the region as a whole, and what's the impact for J&J?
Yeah, another, I'm thinking about the whole life cycle management supervision from health authority getting more and more strengthened. So people may look at the pre-market access, but also need to consider more and more post-market surveillance regulation. I think that's also the big trend.
That's a good point, and we'll come to post-market regulations a little bit later on in our discussions. So given all these complexities and the lack of harmonization, the need for intelligence, what advice would you give to a medtech startup? At what point in time do they need to start thinking about their regulatory strategy? And when should they reach out for help? Because very often the founder and the CEO of a startup venture is not a regulatory expert. At what point do they need to start thinking about this? At what point do they need to start to reach out maybe to advisors and consultants? And maybe Arthur, I'll turn to you first.
Thank you. We talked earlier about whether I'd show a particular slide, and you've just given me the perfect intro to it. Look, one of the things that happens in regulatory consulting is from time to time you get a phone call from somebody who says, I've done all of this work, I've got this wonderful new smart gizmo, it's great, it works beautifully, and now can you do the FDA paperwork for me? It's not just paperwork, of course. If I can just share my screen for a brief moment.
Sure, Arthur, go ahead.
I've got a slide here. If you're a startup company, the point is this, that regulations start sooner than you think. Let me move the little boxes out of the way. And there's a question here. The question is, what's, in the US sense, what's the only regulation that applies to you now when you're a startup developing a product? And it applies long before you go and submit a 510K. But if you don't get it right now, you can lose your 510K later. And the answer is this thing, the design control regulation. So that your product development needs to be done in a controlled way that follows this process. And some of you may be familiar with this diagram. It was drawn by somebody in Health Canada many years ago and has been syndicated around the world. And the anonymous reviewer who did the sketch should have copyrighted it. But the idea is you start, you need to start off with the user and formalize what it is you're trying to make to meet those user needs, and then go through a formal process to test that you've done that and to test that it works in the clinic. We're not going to get into the discussion of design control completely, but just a slightly different version of this slide. The curious thing about medical devices is you've got more than one customer. So you've actually got to design your device to meet not only your users' needs, but to make sure you meet the regulators' needs, and also to make sure you meet the needs of whoever's going to pay for it. Because in the medical device world, it's usually not the patient. It's usually an insurance company or a government agency or a reimbursement body of some kind that pays for it. And that's all a very formal process and lives within, I'm going too far now, but it's a formal process that lives within the real world and gets updated and has review. So to answer the question, you need to be aware of this now, even though it's going to be some time before you submit a regulatory filing, because if you do things properly according to this relatively simple process, then you'll develop a body of documentation that's got rigor behind it, and that puts you in a much better position to deal with the regulator down the track.
Thanks, Arthur. No, that's helpful. And what we'll do is we'll make these slides, of course, available to our participants after the event, so there's no need to do screenshots. So the short answer is early, I think, I think it's a fairly common problem that smaller companies either postpone the decision or they don't necessarily see the importance of regulatory, the impact of regulatory and regulatory related activities early on in the process. So that's
I'd make one supplementary point as well. People
please.
worry about building a quality system. You don't need to get, when you're early, you don't need to get into a full quality system. But writing 2 standard operating procedures, one that says how you're going to control your documents, in other words, a simple procedure for preparing, reviewing, signing off and archiving documents. And the second one to do a simple design control procedure puts you in a strong position to get some rigor into what you're doing early, that you can then use the data for a regulator down the track. Otherwise, you have to do it all again.
That's a great point. And typically, would you expect the founder of a startup who may not have any regulatory background to put together a design control procedure without help and without guidance from an external advisor?
You can get a zillion templates off the web, but a simple conversation with somebody who's experienced in the field would be able to give you a very basic version of that. It's not a hard thing to do.
That's a good point. Jack, anything you want to add to that? Do you agree with that approach?
Yeah, I think early is an important signal. But I also want to offer a different angle as well. We are in a medtech industry. We are not here to sell toy or sell drinks. The medtech industry is highly regulated from everywhere. When you do the R&D, which is clinical trial, all the way to registrations, importation, promotion, post-marketing. It's like the whole life cycle. So, to me, if the startup CEO, when they should involve regulatory, is right from the beginning. When you do the R&D, if you don't know there's a China standard, national standard, then you develop, and then finally you got the, wow, this product's so good, but you don't meet the specification in China, then your China market gone. Then why don't you talk to the regulatory expert, know about, okay, there's a China standard, there may be a Japan standard, etc. Then my R&D more smooth. Then the product come, you can go some market without redoing again. So this regulatory learning could be very expensive if you don't involve them early. So that's why, from my angle, is a whole life cycle. That's why a lot of company, the regulatory, if you talk about a different country manager, regulatory directly reporting to the GM. The GM really want to know what's going on there, like that. So I think that would be my quick answer.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Quick question for Crystal. We're in the middle of a pandemic. How has COVID-19 now affected approval timelines across the region, and maybe the ability to conduct clinical trials and so on? What's your perspective?
Yeah, it is a very big impact, especially for the clinical trial. And for the regulatory side, we're also facing a lot of challenges, like we cannot visit the health of the regulator face-to-face, and cannot have very efficiency communication. But I think industry-wise, everyone put a lot of efforts to make this want to be so impact. From regulator perspective, I think they are also very hard to reset a different requirement, kind of like a notarization change to the electronic signature. So all the regulators thinking from industry perspective. And also specific, this is also the opportunity, what I understand from this market, because health authority also accelerate approval kind of the device related to COVID-19 pandemic to really to faster the market approval.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks for that. We've got a lot to cover. We've got a lot of geographies to cover, and I thought we'd start with, since we're based here out of Singapore, we'll start with ASEAN and Southeast Asia. And I'll turn maybe to Jack first for this question. Maybe if you could just tell us a little bit about how the classification of medical devices in ASEAN differs from what people may be used to in the US and in Europe, and what are the approximate timelines for approval in some of the major Asian markets, and does a CE mark or a US FDA approval typically help in accelerating approval in ASEAN? Jack.
Thank you, Patrick. And I think ASEAN is getting a very attractive market now because it's a big population, etc. And the first question is very important, which is the classification. And by looking at the history, how the ASEAN Medical Device Directive developed, it actually a lot of time is based on the European system. So if I would say, your classification in Europe will be a good reference to the ASEAN system. So that's why I would say, it's more aligned with Europe. In US, the classification is 3 level and Europe is 4 level. So I think it will be easier to compare to a European one, of course. In terms of approval time, of course, depends on the follow-up questions, quality of dossier. Normally 10 to 15 months will be enough for most of the market. Also depends on classification. So it's not very long. But the thing is, the difficult part is not like the so-called documentation or which country. It's about how you follow up, because sometimes you will waste a lot of months in the follow-up. You don't understand the regulator questions, and then you keep on providing the wrong thing, bad follow-up. That kinds of thing really kill time, rather than you don't understand the regulatory documentation, application form is where, that kinds of thing. So that will be the time frame part. A few things I also want the team to aware. In ASEAN, we have this AMDD, ASEAN Medical Device Directive. So you heard a lot about that. Wow, this is good. We are going to harmonize the medical device regulatory system in ASEAN. So that's a few points I want to mention. Number one, this AMDD was started in I think they signed in November 2014, quite a while ago. And they also set up an organization called AMDC, ASEAN Medical Device Committee, to help implementation of this medical device directive in ASEAN member. And the good part about this ASEAN MDD, medical device directive, is you set up a framework, a system that every member in the ASEAN can follow, eventually harmonize. But the thing is, you still need to get approval one by one in terms of country. It's not like one approval applied to the whole ASEAN. But the good news to the company is, at least after you've done the registration approval, maybe in Singapore, when you go to Malaysia, the requirement is not less significantly different, totally new to you. So that's the beauty about this ASEAN Medical Device Directive. And I think the ASEAN team also doing many good work in terms of harmonizing something. For example, they have identified 110 medical devices in terms of risk classification, and then they harmonize in the whole region, so that your classification may be class C in one country, and they will be class C in the whole region. So they are working hard to really do some level of harmonization as well. And also there's 89 products, which is considered as a borderline product, and also being harmonized in the region. So I think there are many good progress, good initiative in the ASEAN side. But different countries have their own political system, timetable to implement the medical device directive. So there's, for example, Laos, in terms of pre-market, they're targeting maybe 2020, Brunei maybe 2022, like that. but to most of the countries, including Singapore, Malaysia, etc., they are more aligned with the AMDD already. For example, Singapore, they even done on 2012 already since that time. So that will be my quick summary in sharing for the team.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Jack. And I know some critics have said there is not, and Arthur mentioned harmonization a little while ago, there's still not enough harmonization, and one could always argue, does a country like Laos really need its own standalone independent regulatory system? Couldn't they just simply say, well, if it's approved by 2 other ASEAN countries and Japan, Canada, US, or the EU, it would automatically get into Laos? Arthur, what are some of your perspectives on the harmonization in ASEAN? And is it moving in the right direction?
It is. I mean, not just talking about ASEAN, but harmonization generally. I'm involved with the Asian Harmonization Working Party, as you know, as an advisor to the technical committee there. And my comment on this is it's all about trust. And let's go to Europe briefly. You know, the issue, the thing that pushed Europe into changing the way it approaches, it's got the same assessment processes underneath in the regulation as it had in the directives, but it was about the lack of trust that the individual member states would all truly implement things in the same way, and that the level of supervision. And so they've decided to centralize. You know, so they've brought everything under control of one central authority and regulation. The ASEAN MDD is a copy, essentially. It's very closely based on the European MDD. And it's been implemented in some quite different ways. You know, the base level requirements are the same, but the administrative processes are quite different between, for example, Singapore and Malaysia or Indonesia. There's got to be a lot more trust between the different ASEAN countries before you can get over that and start to move towards what would be ideal, which would be, you know, one regulatory review good for all of ASEAN. And I think we're some way away from that yet, unfortunately, but because you've got to build up the political trust. But you're absolutely right, and there's a huge variation in capacity across ASEAN as well. Singapore is very sophisticated, Indonesia, Malaysia, sophisticated, Thailand's getting there, and yet you've got others like Myanmar and Laos, got somewhere to go.
Yeah, oh, that's good feedback. So for a Singapore-based startup, would there be benefits for them to seek regulatory approval with the HSA first, or given the Singapore market is so small it's almost negligible in the bigger scheme of things, are there benefits in getting the HSA approval first, or should they forget about that and straight away start to think about the bigger markets, NMPA, China, US FDA, and EU MDR? Jack, your thoughts on that? You're based here in Singapore.
Yeah, I think if you're a Singapore-based company, that is a interesting starting point, because you're Singapore-based, there's 2 advantages you should leverage. Number one, you will have a better Singapore network in terms of knowing the hospital, the customer. And then the second thing is Singapore government, they are, of course, very happy to support their local industry, right? So, you know, that would be the 2 things you should leverage. And that's why there's a good reason you should do the Singapore registration and leveraging those 2 advantages to do your local study with your local government support. Highly recommend. But at the end of the day, which market to go first, it really depends on a lot of factors. Number one, the commercial strategy. Your product, your disease profile, maybe more in other countries, you know, maybe it don't make sense in Singapore. And sometimes it also depends on global launch strategy. You want to go maybe Europe first, then with the CE mark, you can do the other registration quicker. That could be a common global launch strategy. But you know, sometimes company looking for speed. I want to launch tomorrow. I cannot wait. I don't have money to invest, maybe CE mark, etc. Then why don't go to a long regulated market like even Hong Kong? Hong Kong at the moment, the regulatory system is still voluntary. You launch tomorrow. So you see, there's a there's a lot of option. I think the startup CEOs should aware. They are not like straightforward. Hey, okay, every time go US and Europe first, like a golden rule. Then talk about other market. Let's go to the biggest market, maybe China. That's not always the normal way. You need to look at your product, your objective, your patient pool, and even your network. That would be a quick comment.
That's great feedback. Thanks for that, Jack. So maybe let's talk about China. I think it's a critically important market for many of our participating companies, and I'll turn to Crystal here. First of all, obviously with you being based there, I know that both Arthur and Jack have done considerable amount of work in China as well. So the NMPA, which of course used to be the CFDA, there's been a lot of changes over recent years. I think they have many more reviewers now than they did 5-10 years ago. Timelines I believe have become a bit shorter. What's your view overall on what's happening in China with NMPA? What do registration timelines look like? They used to be among the longest in Asia Pacific. What's the status today, and how is NMPA getting along?
Okay, so my understanding from China Regulatory Authority, currently we call it NMPA, they are getting more and more closely willing to communicate with the global side, try to harmonize from regulation. We can tell kind of like UDI regulation, unique device identification, or almost standardized to leverage the global standard instead of create the specific coding system. So we see they are willing to communicate with global side to harmonize the regulation. The registration lead time is definitely shortened compared with last few years. I think one of the reasons they enlarged their capability to build their technical reviewer posts, and also they classify different medical device like class 1, only filing procedure, or we do not need to get approval. So to shorten the industry to bring the product. But for the high classified device class 3, they also pay more attention about safety and efficacy requirement, and also can accept oversee clinical data and the real world evidence data instead of conduct a local trial. So it's getting more and more, I think, a scientific based and also more willing to communicate with the industry.
Right, and you mentioned that briefly. I think China is now NMPA is starting to recognize foreign clinical data in many cases, and that's relatively new, isn't it?
Yeah, yes. Based on the according to the GCP regulation published, so they are open to oversee or accept the oversee clinical data. Yeah, and also I think. Sorry, majority company also joined the global ID study to make the registration lead time much shorter.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Arthur,
go ahead.
Yeah, that's a very challenging thing to do with the foreign clinical data, though, because what the NMPA want are assurances that the foreign data are applicable to the Chinese population, the Chinese demographic, and the Chinese clinical practice. And that's hard to do with foreign data. What the successful cases I've seen have been from pretty large companies who've had very large multinational trials with enough patients enrolled that they could look for the ethnic Chinese subset and reanalyze that sub-cohort of patients and show that you're getting something that's relevant to the Chinese population. So it's something that's very, very difficult for a startup company to do. It's challenging enough for Medtronic or Johnson & Johnson to do it.
Yeah, yes, great. For Asian population, it's one of the critical requirements. Yeah.
So well, that's an interesting point. And are we therefore saying that for a smaller company, a new market entrant to China, that they should pretty much prepare for having to do local clinical trials?
Yeah, I would say so. And bear in mind as well that if you're a Singapore-based company and you want to be a legal manufacturer out of Singapore, China won't talk to you until you've got your HSA approval. You've got to get a local country approval first. Country of origin.
Yeah. No, that's
another. I just want to input. So we do have
please.
a local decision tree to determine if you not 100% to need to mandatory to do the trial. So you need to check if you're apply the device under the clinical trial exemption list. So that's the first step. And the second, you can also leverage what we call the PR approach, clinical evaluation, to compare with currently China marketed predicted device to do the comparison to see any existing literature data can support. The last, you have to go to the local study or join the global ID.
Yeah, no, that's good feedback. Jack, any thoughts from you on China and the need for
I think
China.
Thank you. China is always important market. Going there, like Alpha mentioned, not easy. Very stringent requirement, etc. But the thing is, I still see a lot of startup are managed to go China for many success stories. So it's not like, don't forget that, it's not like this. But like the team mentioned, you need to be super prepared. And maybe your classification risk not that high, only class 1 or 2 only. Then maybe life is not that super strict. And then in terms of clinical study, like Crystal mentioned, there's still a lot of exemption lists. You may be eligible. Then maybe again, so something like this, you should evaluate and check before you go. Maybe your regulatory pathway is not that difficult in China at the end.
That's a great point. So certainly we don't want to discourage our startup companies from looking at entering China and looking at some of the regulatory hurdles there. Yeah, go ahead, Arthur.
I just had a question, if I may, a supplementary on that, is that particularly for companies out of Singapore, where the linguistic challenges may be less than for somebody out of Australia, for example. The thought of becoming Chinese, of setting up either a partnership or establishing a commercial presence in China so that you then have access to the pathways that are only available to domestic companies. Because for lower risk devices, you can go to a provincial regulator in China. I'm just be curious on Crystal and Jack's comment on that.
Crystal, your thoughts on that? Is that going to make things easier? Is that an easier pathway?
So you mean to register the local entity in China?
Yeah, to set up a business in China and do it from there.
Yeah, yes. Similar like Japan, it is a preconditions to set up, to bring the product as the requirement. So the company, if they bring to the product in the market, you have to set up.
No, I'm talking about actually setting up the manufacturing in China so that you become a fully Chinese business.
Yes. So you mean for domestic, in China, we have 2 pathways to get to the product approval. One is imported medical device, like Arthur just mentioned. You need to get the country of origin approval before you bring this as the import medical device. Another is domestic, which means you have manufacture or capability in China. Currently, they promote the MAH concept, which means you can authorize, but still in domestic in China mainland, you find the capability manufacturer to produce, but still under some certain scope, not all the device applicable. You can find the capability manufacturer to produce, still under the pilot. Yeah.
I think for the majority of the startups that are listening in on this webinar, they're not yet at the stage where they're building manufacturing plants in China, shall we say. Having said that, though, there are many that are outsourcing manufacturing to contract manufacturers in China. That's very common. But I'm assuming that if that is not under your legal ownership, that's not going to make it any easier for you to get NMPA approval. Am I correct, Crystal?
Yeah. No, not easy.
It's a complex thing. We could have another 2 webinars on, I think, Frederick. So
Absolutely,
I'll stop disrupting
absolutely.
you.
More to follow on this topic.
Frederick, just one point.
Go ahead,
that's
Jack.
why you can see the different discussion. You realize there are actually many pathways that the startup CEO should aware. Not strictly registration. Sometimes it can be local. Sometimes partner, etc. And one other pathway is maybe your Singapore company, your product made in Malaysia, but you get Malaysia approval first, and then you position your product is manufactured in Malaysia, is a Malaysia company, and then your source country approved already. So so sometimes there are many pathways that the staff still should aware.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, for a smaller company that is not based in China, that is going to go for NMPA approval, would you recommend that they apply directly to NMPA, or do they need an advisor, a consultant, someone to help them navigate the process, assuming that they have, let's say, a Mandarin speaker, someone who can read and write Mandarin? Is it relatively straightforward for a small company to apply directly, or do you need help if you haven't done it before? Crystal?
Yeah, like side, the small companies still need to set up the entity in China to representing, we call the legal responsibility, because from the regulation requirement, you have to entity in there. Either
with a marketing authorization holder as well, I believe, right?
Yeah, yes. And either you can leverage your distributor to on behalf of you to do the submission. But overall, no matter specific the regulatory professionals, but we want to the person who had the interaction with the health authority, one should be understand your product itself, and also to understand how the communication, the strategy to bring your product better, easy to understand from regulator perspective. Yeah. So it depends the situation.
That's a good point. Now, I've had a question here from a couple of our cohort companies, whether it would help to get, in order to get NMPA approval, would it help to have CE mark or to have US FDA approval before? Or if you are, we have one company, one of our startup companies that are based in Eastern Europe, not part of the EU. If they have approval from that country, would they be able to get? Does that make things easier getting NMPA approval? Go ahead, Crystal.
It's the same. Yeah, thanks. So as the import medical device means you need a country of origin approval. So when we're talking about country of origin approval, either the legal manufacturer site or physical manufacturer site.
Yeah.
So no matter is under EU or US, any country, it once get to the local health authority approval, definitely can bring this product to the China. But the reason we keep mentioning about benefit to get EU or FDA approval, because it's a more common practice from majority countries, and the requirement to make familiar about the regulator, so they can easily to request a certain documentation, which is also applicable for EU and FDA. So, but there is no big difference.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And I'm conscious of time, and we have a few more countries to cover as well. Any additional thoughts on before we leave China? Either from maybe Arthur. Arthur, you've got up your hand, Joseph. Please go ahead.
Just one particular thing. I mean, certainly that country of origin thing is very important. So if you're in Eastern Europe, if you're in Belarus or whatever, I think somebody's here from that country, you need an approval from Belarus before China will accept your application, if that's where you're making the product. So that's one thing to think of. Secondly, be aware that the China approval is granted to the manufacturer. The approval certificate is issued in the name of the manufacturer. However, it is physically handed over to the in-country representative. You cannot make an application from Belarus. You have to make an application through a legal entity in China, which means you either set up your own company or you hire somebody to do it for you, or you get your distributor. the NMPA physically hands that certificate to that Chinese company, to a representative. And a lot of the more savvy sort of distributors and whatnot will tell you that it's been issued to them, that they own it. They don't. You own it, but you've got to make sure you can get your hands on it. So be careful of that. Otherwise, you'll find that they hold on to it. And if you want to change distributor, then you've got to persuade NMPA to reissue the certificate, which they will do, but it's a lot of dancing around to do it. So you need to know those subtleties to make sure that you can have maximum commercial freedom to operate.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we've all I think heard horror stories about how manufacturers have been held hostage by their distributors, not just in China, but else it's been happening with the Shonen in Japan and elsewhere, where the distributor holds on to that that registration, and the moment the manufacturer wants to change distributor, they will ask for a ransom and a major payout, and that can turn ugly very quickly. So
Patrick, I want to add one more point here, because me personally also suffer from this pain in one of my company before, which is happening in Taiwan. And then I see there's also a very common challenge in Asia. Like you said, the distributor hold on your license and don't give it back to you. It happened, so that's why, to start company, you need to have this risk mitigation plan for this, how to identify who can hold your license. And one of the golden rule is, of course, you open your own company, you hold your license, that's the best. But if not, my personal advice may be, don't let your distributor hold the license. Your distributor should do the distributor job. You can find another distributor, another regulatory consultant, or another whatever service company to hold your license. But if the same company who hold your license and also doing the distributor for you, they just very reluctant to give you back the license. If you give it back, then my distributor business will also gone, because I no longer can tie with you like that. So that's why, when you find your consultant, find your partner, find your distributor, you should avoid all sorts of these, I call it conflict of interest.
Yeah, that's great advice, and as we said, that it applies in Taiwan, in Japan, and in China, and many other markets as well. So that's certainly something to watch out for. In the interest of time, we'll move on. There are other major Asia Pacific markets, and I wanted to touch briefly on Japan, perhaps Korea, Australia, India, and so on, before we get to Q&A. Now, we do have a couple of companies that are based out of Japan, and one of them is asking, where do they start with their regulatory approval process? They have a cardiovascular device. They're developing it in Japan. They're targeting customers that are based across the globe. Do they first go to PMDA and ask for their advice and help, or get registration locally in Japan, or do they go to the US and US FDA first? Thoughts on that, Arthur, perhaps?
Yeah, it depends on the classification of the device first. The answer is different for different types of devices.
Yeah, I think in this case it's class 3.
Yeah, well, if it's a class 3 in the US, that's going to be an involved process with clinical trials and so on. One of the things somebody thinking about that kind of device should give consideration to is whether they want to seek a medical device single audit program certification. Because that can set you up for a simpler way forward in some other.
Let's talk about that a little bit. I had that coming a little bit later on, but maybe explain in layman's term what is that, and what are the benefits of getting involved in it?
If you're going to Europe or to Australia or to Brazil or whatever, there are local quality system requirements, ISO 13485 or US quality systems regulations, or the Brazilian quality systems approaches and review approaches. Medical device single audit program is a thing that was set up by the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. That's the club of the big regulators, where there will be one audit which looks at the quality system, but also looks at the parts of the quality system that ensure regulatory compliance is met. So make sure that you've got design control, that you've got post-market systems, that you've got proper technical files and things like that. And if you have that certification, then it's going to make your path easier. For example, if you've got a medical device single audit program certificate, which you can get in Japan, the US FDA will no longer audit you, at least not for court, not in routine. They can always, any regulator can audit you for cause at any time, but they'll leave you out of their routine. If you've got a medical device single audit program, and you're in Japan and you have a Japanese approval, you can go to Australia and present those those documents and get an Australian approval based on that. And more of that's coming along. So although MDSAP is more challenging than ISO 13485, it's becoming increasingly small differential as the audit program's getting on. So it's something really worth thinking about.
Yep, that's great. That's a great point. And I think we can do a whole separate webinar probably on MDSAP. So let's maybe park that for now. I did want to just briefly touch on some of the other major Asian markets, Korea, Australia, India. Korea and Australia, of course, are well established. They've had the regulatory systems in place for a long time, and they're sort of cutting edge when it comes to digital technologies, which we'll come to as well. So maybe let's just talk very briefly about India, a major market for many. We have a number of startups that are based in India. What are some of the recent changes that we're seeing at the CDSCO, and how are regulatory pathways changing there? Jack, are you familiar with India? Are you?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think India is another big market, but the regulatory system is still establishing. The good news about India's system is they still aim to harmonize with the global system. They are very actively listening and adopting the GHTF or IMDLF guideline. So their classification system will be 4-level, quality system will be ISO 13485. So that's all good news. You know, they're not creating a very super unique system nobody understands. But you know, when I deal with India regulatory work, there are different kinds of challenge. Number one, their regulator manpower is significantly not sufficient. They are under training. You know, they don't have a lot of so-called support in terms of regulatory training, technology training. Sometimes they just transfer a pharmaceutical regulator to do the medical device regulatory job. So, you know, they maybe, you know, they will ask you for formula. They will ask you for pharmaceutical information. And then, oh, this is my medical device. How can I have a formula? Like that. So I think as a startup, I think you should prepare to be a good partner with the India regulator, i.e., you should offer some sort of education program, maybe about your technology, maybe about some regulatory system understanding. That will be very helpful, rather than just keep on pushing them. How come so long? Why you ask this question? You know, that kinds of thing. So I think that maybe, you know, some tips to deal with India.
Good point. Now I wanted to touch on digital health technologies. We're all familiar with the digital transformation that our industry is going through, and the vast majority of smaller companies that are now developing new products do have a digital component. Many of them are working with proprietary algorithms and artificial intelligence. And I know that countries like Australia and South Korea have been sort of leading the way in the region in terms of developing guidelines for AI. But maybe if you could, and maybe I'll turn to Arthur first on this, what are some of the broader regulatory developments with regard to artificial intelligence in particular in Asia Pac, and are we expecting some degree of standardization there?
Well, this is an easy question.
in 1 minute, please.
In 1 minute. Look,
no, go. Take your time.
AI is something that's terribly misunderstood. You know, there's a couple of levels of it. First, there's AI where somebody's developed an algorithm by training it on a data set, but that algorithm is then fixed. And that's a much easier thing to deal with. I've taken that sort of thing through FDA with AI diagnostics. But if you've got AI where the algorithm continues to train itself, that really challenges the regulatory paradigm, because you no longer have a fixed design which you can assess and anoint and put a seal and all the regulators are struggling with that. All of them. Probably the best practice at the moment is coming out the US FDA, but across Asia Pacific, there just isn't the level of sophistication to deal with that in most markets. So it's really a matter of if you've got that kind of stuff, you're going to have to talk to the regulator about what they expect.
Yeah. Crystal, have you had any experience working with the NMPA in China on artificial intelligence type products, and what are the latest developments there?
Yeah, I think it's a very hot topic, and NMPA also set up a specific committee to have industry discussion. But I think from industry perspective, I do suggest when you bring the AI technology to the device industry, you need to consider how you claim the indication use, intended use, or your indication. I think it's very important to bring your product, what the customer feel their needs. Very important for your market access strategy, because it's really tied to the classification and the regulatory requirement. And not only for China, but I think for South Korea, also the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I know that we have a couple of companies as well that are in digital therapeutics. Is that relatively easier than getting a deep machine learning AI algorithm approved? What are the standards and the guidelines typically for a digital therapeutic in an app, essentially, that is claims therapeutic value? Jack, have you done any work in that area at all?
Yeah, I've done a lot of digital stuff recently. Now I even work in an AI company
to
learn some AI thing. I found that, like Crystal mentioned, this is a very hot topic. And like Alpha mentioned, this technology can mean many things. Everybody talk AI, but it can mean a lot of very different things to regulator as well. So that's why I think there's two important learning there. Number one, there will be not easy to have everything very precise guideline for your own product. It's difficult, no such thing. And you should not just pick somebody guideline and then, I will follow this one. So this is one. There's no specific guideline is available like that. And number two is you need to define your product, like the team mentioned. What is the classification, the intended use? Because every little wording change. I just recently come across a software just to take picture of a wound. Then they will do analysis, do some AI to determine that wound is getting worse or getting better. That give a significant impact to the health of the patient, and less significant, already the classification changed from 1 or 1M already. A lot of different, so how significant of this technology to the health of a patient is subject to a lot of interpretation. And that's why, maybe you should talk to a number of regulatory advisory consultant, and then you try to listen from regulator point of view. Then you formulate your strategy. Okay, this is a different concern. This is a fund market example. Then the intended use you can pick, and then do your pathway. Pick the pathway you want. But I just want to let the team know it's subject to a lot of interpretation. Regulatory is fun. It's not like a word you just read and then you follow. There's lots of between there. You can really enjoy the regulatory system. So I hope the team here, the CEO, will have fun with regulatory like that.
Thanks, Jack. And I am conscious of time here, and I did want to touch briefly before we close on post-market regulations as well. And maybe I'll turn to Arthur here to maybe from a layman's perspective, what exactly is it, and is it something that a startup should start to worry about when they still have maybe 1 or 2 years before they're going to even have a product on the market?
Well, what is it? I'm still trying to figure that out, because when my first job at PGA was director of Postmarket, that was what I went to them for. Look, Postmarket, you need to be aware of it as a startup because you actually use Postmarket data in your regulatory filings. So one of the things that you're doing these days, particularly with clinical evidence, part of the clinical evidence package is what post-market information is available on similar devices. So post-market information, the most commonly understood form is when people make adverse event reports to regulators. When something goes wrong with a medical device, you're required to tell the regulator if you've injured somebody or killed a patient. And there are huge databases. You can go and look at them. The FDA's got one, Germany's got one, Australia's got one. There are lots of these databases. Go and look at them and see what goes wrong with devices like yours, because that will inform your risk assessment and inform your device development about the things you need to know. So you need to understand what it is at this stage. You won't be implementing your own reporting until you've got a product on the market. But it's really something you need to understand what it is right now.
Yeah, and again, like many topics we've covered today, it's one that warrants its own webinar, and or if not, its own 3-day conference. I think on that note, we'll wrap up. What I will ask you to do, and I'll start with Crystal perhaps, is maybe share with the audience some common pitfalls, challenges that you see early and mid-stage companies face, and what advice would you give these companies?
I think it's still in the beginning to bring the regulatory into your earlier stage. It's very important, and although it may not be solve all the problems, I think it's very benefit for you to have built the longer communication with health authority.
Yeah, that's great. Great comment, Jack. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. I really recommend the team to identify more regulatory options. You know, you don't start with what should I do, because that means you only come to one option. Because what options I have, because regulatory pathway like today we just mentioned, you can partner with many party and then create a local manufacturer, or from Malaysia or from Singapore, etc. So that will be something I want the team to consider.
Good. Arthur?
Yeah, I'd like to just build on something that Jack just said before. He was absolutely right when he said it, and that is, put it in a different way, regulatory affairs is like real estate. It's about position, position, and position. The way it's not what your device is or your software is, it's what it does and what you claim for it that matters. And that not only determines how it's regulated, it can determine how you can address the market. And I see a most common pitfall is in these days of software apps, oh, my app just collects information. It doesn't do diagnoses, therefore it's not a diagnostic device. That's not true. The very act of collecting information makes it diagnostic. The app or the device doesn't have to make the decision for the doctor. As long as it's providing information that goes into the therapeutic workflow, then it's a regulatable thing. And so you need to understand where you fit in the zoo. It's all about position.
Great points there. And I'll ask all of you as well if there are any free online resources that you can recommend to our audience. I know, Arthur, that at Brandwood you have a number of videos and information that's accessible. Maybe you want to comment on what's available there, and if there's anything else that you'd like to point startups to.
We have on our website on BrandwoodCKC.com quite a library of other webinars, training webinars, and we make a point. Each of them's a good 45 minutes long, and we get into the subject in a bit of depth. So you can go there and see a whole lot of stuff on post-market, pre-market, diagnostics, whatever. So that's a plug for us. The other website I'd suggest you look at is fda.gov. There's a huge amount of information on that website and on some of the other regulators' websites, including the HSA's website.
Very good. And our cohort, how can they, and our viewers, how can they contact you?
Look, I'll give you the slide to send round. There's all my contact details.
We'll circulate that. Very good. So go to the BrandwoodCKC website and you'll find all the information there. Thanks, Arthur. Jack?
Yes, I think we are also running an association, Asia Regulatory Professional Association. So I think we will also have some slide talk about our website, email address, LinkedIn, etc. And we are more focused on the education to share good practice. So I think if you want some network like that, we are happy to help you. So that will be some resource you can make use of.
Very good.
And we also have a book.
You mentioned, very exciting. What is the ARPA URL? What's the website?
It's ARPA.edu.com. Edu like the education. So ARPA.edu.com. And then you can even go to Amazon, to buy this book called Asian Medical Device Regulatory Handbook. It's written by all sorts of regulators in the world and some industry experts as well.
Send us the details. We'll circulate it to the audience afterwards.
Okay.
Thanks, Jack. Crystal, any thoughts on free online resources that you're available or that you're aware of? Anything either in China or elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think FDA also have a lot of material to share, and also like industry association. I do suggest us to have a company to pay more attention to join the association, so to get support. So I can share my personal email and also contact Frederick to build a connection.
That's
also,
great.
Yeah.
And we'll circulate
that's very
that.
good. Ask Crystal is a good choice.
We'll circulate that. And I'll put in a plug for APAC Med, the Regional Trade Association. They have a very active regulatory affairs committee. So at the moment you're a member there, you get plenty of information. Right, we're well over time. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. We could have gone on here for another 2 hours without any difficulty. Really appreciate the time. Stay on. What we're going to do now is we're just going to end our live stream on YouTube, and we'll move on to Q&A with our cohort. So for those of you viewing us on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us, and do tune in next week when we'll be speaking about medical device reimbursement topics.